Hello, we're your hosts, Sourish
and Kuan,
This is WaffleByte,
where we bring you interesting bites about technology,
business,
and things that might change the world.
You can find all our sources in the description,
and you can skip to the chapters you're most interested in.
But for now, enjoy the show. Today, we take a look at a new social media app, 739. We also look at OpenAI's explosive growth in India, as well as lab-grown meat and the recent bans in Mississippi. And finally, we'll also look at how Shopify is integrating AI into their business.
And we take a look at the world's premier news agency, Reuters, and how they started delivering stock market quotes with pigeons.
The thought for this week is, Kuan, you're in China right now. 87% of the population there pay through their smartphones, but just 4% in the USA do. That's a factor of 22. So, how have smartphones become such a dependency in China? First off, 739. A few weeks ago, a developer called Mark launched a social media app to the public, 739. As the name suggests, the platform is only available from 7:39 every day for precisely 3 hours Eastern Time. The app itself is akin to a basic Twitter clone. Now, Mark initially built the app just for him and his friends, but now says that expanding it is an experiment he's interested in following. Now, this reminds me of Be Real, because it started a few years ago, Be Real, made by a single developer in France, and that was also a time-based social media app where the idea is to limit the amount of time that users spend on social media by reducing the app's functionality to specific times every day. And Be Real, of course, had plenty of traction, eventually selling for $500 million. But then, in recent months, Be Real rapidly lost users and traction, and no one really knows why, but general consensus is a variety of reasons, such as the lack of engaging content like, short-form videos. There's also the authenticity factor that's beginning to fade away as it becomes like any other social media platform where photos and videos are planned days in advance. There's also the novelty that's now worn off. And finally, where the company that bought Be Real is trying to monetize it through ads, which has deterred users.
I think the problem is when you try to make a social media app that's actually good, it ends up not doing well, because you actually need to make a bad social media app that addicts people in order for it to do well and gain users. And so it's sort of like a paradox where these creators and these developers who are trying to create something that's more authentic or innovative, they actually end up suffering because they don't get people to become addicted to the app. And so eventually they end up fading away from public view and ultimately are unsuccessful.
Yes, it seems like apps like these are effectively a bit of a trend. Like they become viral for a short period of time, then they fade away into nothingness. Now, 739 in particular is kind of dubbed, or at least it's intended to be a bit of a throwback to the 90s and early 2000s. So this is meant to represent what social media looked like before the smartphone. And obviously, Kuan and I have never experienced that, but generally this means that there are only specific times where people can go online, right? Only after school or during certain hours of the day where you have access to the computer and the internet. And there's also this chat room vibe on 739, where back in the old days, you had chat rooms on the internet, and to even get onto a chat room in the first place required a level of technical expertise, such that the people talking on the chat room were generally not trolls. They were generally very genuine and very kind and honest users, which is definitely not what we see today in mass social media. So right now, 739 has about 3,000 users. So some days there just isn't very much content that's being posted, but the rate of growth is pretty high. Now, it's obviously not crazy high, but I do suspect that this will follow a very similar trajectory to Be Real. Now, this raises an interesting question, because the social media idea, the whole social network idea, is fascinating to me, because there are so many possible different ways you can structure this online network between other humans, which is fundamentally what the internet's created to do. And of course, Meta, or I guess Facebook, was perhaps the first company that really made it big. And there are lots of other companies that have tried and succeeded, and many, many, many more that have failed. So, what on earth works?
I think Meta had the advantage of being early, right? Facebook sort of didn't really have any competition, and so it benefited from having sort of a monopoly. But I think in the modern day, we're seeing that you need people's attention to work, right? For a social media app to work, it needs to be addictive. People need to want to use it constantly every day. They want to go back to it. But also, it needs to eventually make money. And it seems as though that the premier way to make money via social media is advertising, but increasingly we're seeing that shopping is perhaps also a good way to make money for social media companies. Now, the combination of this essentially means that obviously for ads to be served, it needs to be addictive and vice versa. But also for it to be successful and for it to attract a lot of users, it also needs to be addictive. So I think the core is that social media apps essentially must be addictive and successful in stealing your time away from you, essentially. Otherwise, I don't see that, a social media app where you actually have a healthy relationship with it, where you go on it for 5 minutes a day, can actually survive and become successful.
I think I agree. I think a non-addictive social media app just will not work. And I think people will always continue trying to experiment with new forms of social media. For example, recently I talked to someone who was part of a startup that now failed. But what they were trying to do is they were essentially kind of combining Reddit and Notion. So if you think about that, so how do most people view Reddit? They view Reddit as kind of humanity's knowledge base on the internet, like the more truer, honest, raw feelings that people have and opinions that people have, just unfiltered, thrown onto Reddit. And Reddit is a treasure trove of information, which is why Google pays so much to Reddit to scrape Reddit's pages to appear in Google search results. But anyway, the thesis of this company, or the startup, was essentially that people really, really, really like the fact that Reddit has so much knowledge, but they don't like how disorganized and random it is. And therefore, if you can organize it in a Notion-style way, almost like a Notion notebook for all of the internet, then that will be an incredibly popular service. And, well, that failed. Not necessarily due to the idea, but I'm just wondering, what do you think of that idea, Kuan?
I think it's essentially not going to work, because the benefit of Reddit is that it has humanity's collective wisdom, if you would like, from the prior 10, 20 years. And you simply cannot recreate that, because there's such a huge incumbent advantage with social media apps because of the existing user base and the fact that it has a history of, in Reddit's case, people's posts about whatever they post about. And so you cannot generate information. So short of copy and pasting everything from Reddit and organizing it, there's not much you can do, because you need the snowballing effect of having existing content and then attracting people to post new content. And actually, on Reddit, firstly, not many people use it, right? Compared to, for example, Instagram, it is simply tiny. And in addition, a lot of people who do use it, as you rightly pointed out, don't like the fact that it's poorly organized. But still, the point is that people keep returning to it because of the incumbent advantage. So I'm actually very pessimistic about any startup in the social media space that is trying to create, the new social media. I think what is interesting, though, is that we see the success of TikTok, and I do wonder if, for example, social media apps localized to particular regions of the world may have success in entering different markets. I'm thinking of, for example, RedNote has had its period of success. I think it's a very addicting app. However, I think that because of other issues, it may not find such success.
I mega disagree. So, firstly, I think that one reason Reddit will succeed over this idea that we talked about earlier is because people just love arguing online, and the ability to essentially live argue with someone else in a public space is very appealing to much of humanity. And that's one big I guess you could call, benefit of Reddit. Now, the second bigger point I wanted to make is that I do think that whilst the social network that an app or a service develops over time is unbelievably powerful, like Instagram, and makes it very hard to get off Instagram, ultimately, humanity is relatively mobile, and trends change, and yes, it may not occur on a year-by-year basis, but definitely occurs on maybe a 5-year or 10-year basis. And something like that is essentially the reason that a company like Meta bought Instagram, bought WhatsApp, and is buying all these other companies and experimenting with threads and all sorts of things. Because social media, whilst yes, when it's big, it's very hard to go poof, it will go poof over time. And therefore, it's all about finding the next trend. And that's why I do think social media startups have potential. But I also think it's ultimately just experimentation. And 99% of them just won't work.
Of course, startups are always experimentation, but I think it's interesting to note that, to me, the last real social media app that started from scratch was Instagram, when it then got bought by Meta, because TikTok, which was sort of the new thing after Instagram, if you will, they actually was started by ByteDance, and ByteDance was a fairly big company. So one wonders if in the future, the next social media app, as you rightly pointed out, every sort of 5-10 years, there's sort of a new thing. It was Instagram, now it's TikTok. Will actually come from a startup, or will it come from a established company? And I think that is interesting to think about.
Next up, OpenAI in India. So, ChatGPT currently has 500 million active weekly users, and Sam Altman has recently reiterated his desire to hit 1 billion users. Now, helping towards that goal is the huge growth which ChatGPT has seen in India, which the OpenAI COO now claims to be their fastest growing market. And with almost 1 billion internet users in the country, you can see why they're so pleased with this craze. However, as ChatGPT Plus is priced the same in India, despite the much lower living costs, the number of paid subscriptions has been tiny and is 2 magnitudes away from the revenue generated through US Plus and Pro subscribers. So this makes me question if countries like India, where services tend to be cheaper, will not benefit from the AI rush as much as others. Because given that all of the infrastructure and much of the research is still happening in America and much of the West, India will struggle to bring AI to the masses unless, I think, the government gets involved.
I think it's very true. I think with AI, certainly, unless you have a very easy access to capital, like we see quite possibly in San Francisco, you need institutions and or governments with access to resources to lead the charge of generative AI deployment. And we see that, for example, in China with big companies, big companies like Tencent or like Alibaba, these multi-billion, multi-hundred billion companies have enough money to essentially burn it off to engage in the development and deployment of AI, right? And we're seeing actually that in China, another big emerging market, albeit one that's slightly more closed off, AI is huge, certainly after DeepSeek. And actually, there was a good amount of adoption amongst the sort of educated and those more familiar with Western services and software and things like that with ChatGPT. But DeepSeek really had this huge paradigm shift of AI in China because it was a sensational story that was picked up by the media, which is of course heavily sanctioned by the government. And it was this huge nationalistic movement that really turbocharged Gen AI development in China and adoption. And actually, DeepSeek is everywhere now. It's integrated in all sorts of apps, and you can do things with it. And it's supposedly meant to help you. Now, of course, with that, there are two caveats. One is that just because it's integrated in things does not mean it's being successfully monetized. As you pointed out, in India, monetization is struggling. And secondly, of course, we see that whilst the adoption is greater, it is still not that high, given if you consider China as a population of around 1.4 billion, and the vast majority of this population is lesser educated and not able to engage with these things. So you're really only seeing a tiny fraction of the Chinese population, which albeit is still a very large number, engaging with generative AI.
So what ChatGPT is facing in India is very similar to what Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok all faced when they tried to grow or move or expand in India. Because all of these services, they essentially still relied on the expensive Western infrastructure and costs and all of that stuff, but played in a much lower cost market such as India. So the solution was that YouTube, WhatsApp, and Instagram in particular all partnered with Jio, which is India's #1 provider for data and cellular service. I believe they have over 400 million customers, which is quite big. And Sam Altman basically wants to follow suit and also partner with Jio to try and integrate ChatGPT into more of the Jio products and services. Now, in particular, what Google and Meta did to grow YouTube, WhatsApp, and Instagram is they both invested around $5 billion into Jio and integrated their services into essentially Jio's apps and Jio's like shopping service and delivery service and whatnot. And this is also good because the $5 billion investment each of them gave into Jio essentially accelerated the expansion of 4G and across India, and therefore the rate of Indian internet users has increased a lot because of this investment, on top of the fact that they are now promoting their apps to these brand new users. So Sam Altman basically wants to do the same thing with ChatGPT. Another strategy that YouTube and TikTok both employed was launching light apps, which were versions of the apps designed for lower spec hardware devices and also worse, spottier internet connections across India. And these, of course, cost both YouTube and TikTok less, whilst also making them more popular apps. So maybe ChatGPT can do the same, right? Maybe they can just offer their weaker models to India and, for example, turn off the image generation feature, which would definitely be very costly to OpenAI.
I think we need more light apps because I think a lot of mobile apps have excess bloat. And if people considered and respected your mobile phone's resources and battery, possibly speaking, we would have a better experience because we would have less bloat on our mobile apps, which would be fantastic.
And the final key thing that both YouTube and TikTok also did is they embraced the Indian languages. So whilst ChatGPT can currently speak pretty much any language, maybe OpenAI can focus on trying to optimize it for the languages most commonly used in India. Anyway, one thing, or probably the thing, that fueled this influx of users in India was the launch of 4.0 image generation. And in fact, in the first week of this feature being released to chatgpt.com, over 700 million images were created, which is absolutely nuts. That's over 100 million images every single day. And as I'm sure everyone listening to this has seen, you now see a ton of images that just have kind of shifted human internet culture, right? You see basically the Ghibli images that we see flooding the internet today.
I think it's slightly unfortunate because this influx of junk essentially has caused a material decrease in the quality of content on the internet. I think it was declining before, but this has really accelerated this sort of decline in quality. And actually, nowadays, you have to really start digging to find something useful. On the other side, though, I think this is representing significant leaps in capabilities of generative AI. I think that it is not necessarily being used for anything hugely productive at the moment, because to me, the premier use is essentially junk on the internet. And I think that is slightly regrettable. I wish we could find better uses of our newfound capabilities.
It just amuses me that Sam Altman probably sat somewhere in an OpenAI office with a big red button and clicked it and immediately saw how his tool is shifting the way that humanity operates online. Next up, Mississippi meat. Mississippi becomes the third state in the USA to completely ban lab-grown meat. Whilst this may seem redundant, as lab-grown meat barely exists and certainly isn't sold in the state. The increase in bannings has resulted in a significant decrease of investment into the sector. Multiple cultivated meat labs shut down and laid off employees, following a $700 million decline in investment from 2022 to 2023. Now, these bills of banning lab-grown meat are essentially a political move. But putting politics aside, do they otherwise make practical sense?
I'm slightly wary of these bills because of the fact that, as you stated, lab-grown meat barely exists, right? And so, one thinks that it would be good to actually see the potential of this industry and see what possibilities it offers before banning it, like Mississippi has done. However, it does seem that people are not a fan of lab-grown meat, and quite possibly this bill was popular, so you could argue that it makes sense because it's the will of the people, but otherwise I'm not entirely sure on this move, and in fact I'm not entirely sure on lab-grown meats. In general, as a meat eater, I certainly do like my dead cows.
One thing I don't like about this is how it kind of goes against some of the core principles of a democracy, and especially a country like the USA, where there should be free trade, right, and innovation. And, these meat products should at least kind of come to fruition and begin to be tested, like, in the supermarket, essentially, and see whether users or consumers buy them. And of course, if consumers don't buy them, well, that's the average consumer sharing their opinion, and therefore these companies are going to go out of business anyway. So I really don't like these bills, and I think they are illogical. However, I think the people who pass them and support them don't necessarily see it just as a political move. I think many of them truly believe essentially what you just said, which is that, well, I don't want to be eating meat that was grown in a petri dish. I want to be eating like some cow that was farmed on some green pasture on a mountain somewhere. But I don't think that really makes much sense, because fundamentally, well, at least in theory, the products you're eating, the cells and the chemicals you're eating are identical, and they are packaged in the same identical way, arguably in an even healthier way.
I think not necessarily everybody would agree with your statement that America should be about free trade. Certainly, in recent days, we're seeing that play out. But I do agree in that people are essentially allowing their emotions to dictate the fact that they do not hold any hope to the lab-grown meat industry. And as I said, I think that is regrettable because we should at least see the potential of this industry. Having said that, though, it does not seem that lab-grown meat has made a huge amount of progress, certainly in the last 10 years, because I have not really seen lab-grown meat at all. And one wonders if there are other ways in which we could develop our food industries to better the food that we eat, but also minimize our impact on the planet. Because quite possibly, with the advent of alternatives to meat, it may not be the most optimal solution.
I guess a couple of points about that. Firstly, well, perhaps the reason that we're not seeing much progress is the investment that is being taken away essentially by politics, which I think is never really a good thing. And secondly, I think yes, like I don't really see us having lab-grown meat feasibly like within the next few years and people buying them. However, what about in 10 years, 15 years from now? Like the overpopulation will hit us, even if it's only for a brief portion of humanity. But during that brief portion, we will appreciate inexpensive meat, and perhaps lab-grown meat is the answer to that. Shopify's CEO has sent a company-wide memo stating that teams can only get more resources to increase their headcount by first proving why they cannot get what they want done using AI. The memo said that it's now a baseline expectation for employees to use AI reflexively. Now, whilst this does seem like a slightly more head-on and forceful way to embed this culture into the company, I do think that I agree with the principle itself.
I think it's become very clear that there are indeed ways to increase productivity in companies by using AI. And I think it's also become very clear with the rate of adoption of corporate AI solutions that, in fact, people do not use such methods as much as they should. And I think Spotify's CEO has clearly realized this point and wants to change that. Now, the way in which he's doing this, I think, is will probably achieve the goal, but I think it will have a side effect of making people rely on AI too much and possibly reducing the thinking and the problem solving that makes, you know, companies excellent, right? If you're defaulting to AI instead of thinking about the best solution and performing this best solution, if you're defaulting to AI, then you may get a mediocre solution, but it may not be best. And I worry that is the danger with this.
The CEO claims that AI should be used to help multiply the craft of his employees. So, AI shouldn't necessarily do the thinking for the employees, or so he claims, but it should instead allow the employees to spend more time doing the actual problem solving and the actual work, and AI can just multiply it, whatever that means. I imagine that means they can do more per unit of time by getting, for example, all of their more boring, monotonous work done for them. But I do think that more companies need to really adopt this principle, and more people do as well, because I think that essentially humans are already cyborgs. Like, we already have such a huge reliance on our technology. If I asked you the weather, Kuankuan, you'd have no clue what to do without your phone, or the internet in general. And I think this kind of extends now to the AI realm, where over time, slowly, more and more people are becoming cyborgs with AI, such that if you remove any LLM tooling that they have, well, they now become less competent human beings. And I don't necessarily think that creating this dependency on AI is such a bad thing, right? We have this technology, and this is something that I think can really increase our ability as a human being. And that's why I really agree with this memo.
Obviously, efficiency gains are the entire point of this because companies these days, especially in the current economy, want to trim their headcounts, right, and increase efficiency. I also think, though, that whilst I agree in that this is generally moving in the right direction, I think that it is questionable insofar as how much it will work, right? Because in certain functions of the company, you have to deal with things like legal, things like um, compliance, and things like that. And I think that at some point, middle managers may want to essentially cover their rear end and to not be responsible for any problems that this blanket use of AI could cause. And I think this layer in between the sort of the management and the ultimately the engineers and the employees, I think that will cause issues. And I think that I'm skeptical as to how well this will actually work in Shopify, as I'm not sure there will be a huge measurable increase in efficiency. I think it will be fairly small, if measurable at all. I do think, though, that your point about cyborgs, whilst that's one way of putting it, I think AI is ultimately a tool, right? And we use tools every day. We use our phones; they're very good tools, and as you rightly pointed out, people rely on them. And I think that ultimately makes us more productive and better humans. But of course, it does make us lose some capabilities, as I mentioned earlier. Because back to your point about the weather, if I asked you how to get from A to B, well, without using Google Maps, you may have lost the navigational abilities that you would have had, 20 years ago, if you didn't have Google Maps, right? And I think to some extent that is lamentable. But of course, the overall direction of travel is that we are becoming more specialized, becoming more efficient by using all these wonderful tools we have. And I also think that finally, the final point is that AI needs to be abundant and cheap for this to actually happen. And I think currently, with the amount of data centers we're building and the emissions that's creating, that's perhaps not entirely true.
That's an interesting point because AI is abundant and cheap for the end users or even companies who use AI products, but it isn't cheap for the companies that are creating the AI products who are typically losing money on them. So I wonder how long that's essentially going to last, right? At some point, these big companies like OpenAI and Meta, they're going to have to stop subsidizing the cost of their models. And when that happens, I don't know what's going to happen. I think the world's a bit screwed at that point.
We need to remember that the only reason AI is, as you said, abundant and cheap right now is because it's being subsidized by VC money, the same way that Uber was 10 years ago now at this point. And so once this money dries up, as we've seen with things like Uber and frankly everything that's been venture funded, prices go up, right? And in this case, if prices of AI goes up to what it actually costs, well, I'm not sure that a lot of the things that we take for granted now these days are truly sustainable, because even with OpenAI's most premium tier of $250 a month, they're still losing money, right? So the real cost is going to be much higher. Have you ever heard something like, according to the news agency Reuters?
We will not stop until the last drug lord, the last financier have surrendered or put behind bars.
I welcome the fact that the other leaders will be meeting to discuss Brexit tonight.
We are in a rigged system. We need in our country law and order, and if I'm elected president, that will happen.
Reuters is a leading news agency with a fascinating history. Alongside rivals such as the Associated Press, they have bureaus all around the world with journalists reporting on all sorts of issues. Smaller media outlets without the capacity of having staff around the world are then able to subscribe to their work and produce media content based on Reuters reporting. However, you'll be surprised to know that Thomson Reuters, the parent company of Reuters, since a 2008 merger, derives only single-digit revenue from news reporting. Instead, the $70 billion company is a diversified conglomerate, providing services across tax, law, and markets. Today we'll focus on the news agency Reuters, how it started, and its role now in modern-day society. After several failed attempts, in 1851, Paul Reuter, a German-born entrepreneur, set up an office near the London Stock Exchange to deliver financial information to mainland Europe. He was able to use the newly installed undersea telegraph cables between England and Belgium to transmit stock quotes, but had to resort to using pigeons for a 76-mile stretch between Brussels and Aachen, which wasn't yet covered by telegraphs. This proved to be very successful, and he was able to outcompete rivals who were using trains and horses. Famously, in 1865, Reuters was the first news agency to bring the news of President Abraham Lincoln's assassination to Europe. This solidified Reuters' position as an international news agency, and over the next decades they expanded to other European cities as well as Bombay and Shanghai in Asia. This was made possible by undersea cables and telegraph lines. But by the early 20th century, Reuters had become a key player in international communication, and they supplied news to newspapers, financial institutions, and governments. And in 1923, the agency began actually transmitting news via radio signals. So during World War II, however, concerns over editorial independence and ownership pressures led to the introduction of the Reuters Trust Principles in 1941. And these principles of integrity, independence, and freedom from bias drove Reuters news reporting until this official trust principle was scrapped in the merger with Thomson Corporation in 2008.
I know Reuters, as I said, is a small part of the company, but it's an important part, maybe the most high-profile part, and important given things going on in society today. And I know that you're proud of the fact that it's kind of right down the middle. Talk to us about how important Reuters is.
Yeah, so Reuters is governed, all of Thomson Reuters is governed by what we call the trust principles. And just a very quick history lesson around those. It was about 1941 when the trust principles were formed by the Reuters board, effectively to govern all of the news and information that was produced by the Reuters team across the world. And essentially it required that anything under the Reuters brand is independent and fact-based, it's triple-checked, it's unbiased, and is of the highest quality reporting and journalism.
Despite controversies, including funding by the British government in the 1960s, Reuters grew steadily to the leading news agency that we know today. Its journalists and photographers have won multiple awards and are known for their reporting in war zones, as well as for their investigative journalism pieces. Thomson Reuters, the parent company of the news agency Reuters, also has other subsidiaries with businesses in financial markets, where they compete with the likes of Bloomberg, and in other sectors, in addition to, of course, the news agency. After the finalisation of the merger, though, the news agency became an even smaller part of the combined business, with Thomson Reuters instead deriving most of its revenue from companies like Westlaw, which is a service for law firms. But I thought Reuters was particularly fascinating because even though they make up a very small part of the company, they are by far the most well known and have a huge influence in what we hear in the news daily. But with the advent of social media, where a lot of young people get their news from, I wanted to explore the idea of, are they becoming less relevant? Because, Reuters still to this day has a big focus on the truth, on fairly neutral reporting. But is this less relevant nowadays with people's relationship with the news?
I do think they are becoming less relevant because more and more people get their news from social media and from word of mouth. And I think that's kind of a trend that we've been seeing for quite a while now.
It used to be in journalism that people had a certain respect for the truth and for fact-based reporting. But it seems though that these days people are more willing to stay in their echo chambers and more willing to believe things that they see on social media, online, and things that may not even be true. And I do think that this possibly undermines Reuters' position as a global news agency, especially because also people are not reading newspapers anymore, right? And actually Reuters struggled tremendously with the digital transformation, and after the dot-com bubble, they did really struggle. And more recently, they've tried to experiment with their own website, but unfortunately for them, it's actually not very used. It's only the 27th most viewed news website, and you would think it would be higher given all the reporting that they do. But also, you cannot mention really anything these days without mentioning generative AI. And of course, Reuters, being a news publication, they publish a huge amount of material, right? And actually, recently, they struck deals with AI companies to allow them to use their backlog for training. And I thought this was very interesting because, Sourish, do you not think that by allowing companies to train on their news, they're essentially inadvertently making the AI models better at generating random news articles that will end up being fake? Do you not think that they are playing a part in the spread of misinformation via AI?
That's going to happen anyway, whether Reuters supports it or not, and so I don't really see much point in them really going against it. Also, since as the market, just the whole media market and the whole media industry increases over time, Reuters is losing proportional or relative to the rest of their competitors, then I think, I guess a more sneaky perspective of this whole situation is that Reuters is doing this to essentially put their competitors out of business or make their competitors struggle faster and quicker, which of course affects Reuters disproportionately less than it affects their competitors.
It's very interesting because you would wonder why that Reuters still actually exists, because, if you're a consumer of news, why don't you cut out the middleman and go straight to the source with Reuters, but it seems as though that people are very comfortable with their local newspaper, their local news station, and are not willing to do that. And I think that is very interesting. But finally, I wanted to explore the idea of trust, because through their long history, over 150 years of reporting the news, they broke several major news stories, and they broke, I believe, just recently some things to do with Elon Musk last year and his relationships with people and him as a person. How do they gain trust with the public, and is it warranted? Because we see that in recent years, trust in the media has hit all-time lows, right? And even as Reuters, which is a fact-based reporting institution, why do people not trust them? And why can't other news agencies be trusted? And I think that's a very fascinating thing. So do you have any opinions?
This whole thing is just really interesting, but also really philosophical, because Reuters has built their business over 150 years by essentially by essentially reducing the communication of information to the smallest time possible. And I guess with the advent of the internet, that time is essentially reduced to an instant. And so it's now not a question of who can transfer the information from place A to place B the fastest. It's now a question of who can get access to the correct information the fastest, right? If you are sitting in a war zone, you will see something faster than someone else who's sitting 100 meters away from you behind you. And so I guess that's kind of what you need to do to win. And that's becoming increasingly difficult as, there are more and more cameras and microphones and people just across the world seeing stuff. Some random person on TikTok can easily outcompete you as a news organization with finite resources. But I guess back to the question about, is this dangerous when you place kind of a lot of trust into into an allegedly fact-based reporting organization such as Reuters? And I guess very difficult because, how do you ever determine what is truth, right? Truth is essentially what the individual determines to be truth. And that obviously varies from human to human and organization to organization. And I think to ever kind of consider the word truth in any of these news organizations, I think that's not the correct approach for us as the consumer of these articles and information to be taking. I think the correct approach is probably something more like, this is what this company perceives to be true about the world. And that's just one of several data points I have. And I kind of have to look at the others and determine, firstly, does it actually matter in my life? And secondly, if it does having this perspective become helpful in my life versus having a different perspective?
I think on the truth of whatever is published, it's very interesting because Reuters almost acts as a middleman, right? Because you have the reporter writing the final article for your Daily Mail or your local news station, and Reuters is in the middle between that and what's actually happening. And I think that puts them in a position to be slightly more trusted, because when there is outrage at media organisations, it's often directed at the person writing the newspaper, right? And a particular news article, particular journalists. But actually, we also saw with Reuters, there was a couple of years ago a situation where they were giving a voice on a platform that they have, which allowed third-party contributors to essentially publish things, and this Russian organisation was allowed to publish on a Reuters sanctioned platform, and there was huge public outrage because of the fact that they argued that you simply cannot trust an organisation that is spreading misinformation, and so by Reuters giving these people a platform, there's a huge conflict of interest with what the Western government is trying to do, with the whole idea of Reuters, that they're a fact-based organisation. And I think this is an extremely difficult balance to strike between trust and freedom of speech and allowing people to publish their voices, right? Because if you allow people to publish what they want to say, then inevitably you can lose trust when what people say is not true because of the fact that this particular organisation was actually Russian propaganda. But I think what you said is ultimately true in the way we consume media, but unfortunately, the way we consume media is not necessarily as you described. It's often based in echo chambers, and in that sense, from the perspective of somebody who is within their own echo chamber, then you can see why Reuters might be considered to be less truthful, right? If the truth, what they determine, is what they always hear in the echo chamber, but what Reuters is saying is not in line with that, then it is considered less truthful. And I think that extends to other organizations as well, and possibly to greater extents, because of the fact that they are closer to the end consumer and Reuters is further removed. But finally, interesting to note that Reuters is, of course, majorly controlled by the Thomson Reuters company, which is itself majority owned by a wealthy family, the Thomson family. And actually, I think it would be interesting to end on the thought that, is it dangerous for billionaires to be controlling news organizations with Rupert Murdoch, with Jeff Bezos, and increasingly, you could argue that X is becoming somewhat of a right-wing news organization, and Elon Musk obviously owns X. So, do you think there's anything we can do about this? Because I think there isn't. And do you see a danger with the billionaires owning our news?
I don't think there's much we can do about it. Now, do I see danger? I'm not too sure. I guess if you take the Gary Stevenson approach, then yes, of course, these billionaires are all buying these organizations to control our minds and turn the population against each other and showcase that the issue is nothing to do with the billionaires themselves. But if you kind of put that approach or that perspective to the side, then is there another issue or another potential issue with the billionaires owning these platforms? And I don't necessarily think there is. I think for as long as you have billionaires who disagree and who are willing to disagree, particularly, for example, Trump and Musk, who are very, very willing to disagree with other billionaires and perhaps not have favorable terms with them, then I think a case like that, it's probably beneficial for these news organizations to be run by billionaires, because that is essentially an infinite supply of funding, which they may otherwise not get. However, we do of course risk the Trumps and the Musks leaving, and regardless of what you think of their view, what they do is they challenge the rest of the media. And regardless of, again, what you think of what's right and what's wrong, we always do need a challenger. And if a challenger disappears, then I do think we have problems. So I don't think this is necessarily a sustainable thing, that the billionaires are essentially controlling our media. However, as of right now today, I don't really see much of a problem with it.
Despite being responsible for much of the world's news, Reuters remains a low-profile organisation built on principles of trust, something scarce in modern-day society. Its work may become increasingly challenged as people grow to reject their reporting, as trust in the media is at an all-time low. Given the decline of small news organisations and the shifting ways in which people consume news, one wonders what role they will play in society in the future.
And the thought from the beginning of the episode was, Quan, you're in China right now. 87% of the population there pay through their smartphones, but just 4% in the USA do. That's a factor of 22. So, how have smartphones become such a dependency in China?
Well, I think it's true that China is incredibly mobile first, and everything is done through your phone, right? You pay through your phone using WeChat or Alipay. You get an Uber or the Uber equivalent. You can book a hospital appointment. You can shop. You can do shopping via, for example, Taobao or the Chinese version of Temu, and even we're seeing live stream shopping, etc. So it's very true that China is incredibly mobile phone oriented, and I think the reason is because with the development of China economically came the internet, and the medium in which the internet was accessed by ordinary people was through the smartphone. And that was not the case in the West, for example, because of the fact that in the West, we went through a phase of landline phones, bringing the internet to modems, etc., and ultimately people used computers and got used to using computers and websites and browsers and the web. instead of mobile phones. And because the development was earlier, people were still sort of familiar with that and less resistant to change. So whereas in China, mobile phone was sort of what all the services was built on, that is not the case in the West. For example, Google was built in a browser, and similar with many other companies. And so that's the main reason why China is mobile first. Now, it also helps with the Chinese government pushing integration with WeChat. That's very beneficial because you don't have competition like in the West, because everything's on the same platform. So you become very silly to not be on this platform. But I think a lot of things are the way there are in China because of a mixture of the development factor and also the Chinese government factor, which I think is quite a big one. And for many people who come to China, including lots of tourists, it's really a culture shock, the reliance on the mobile phone. And if you don't have WeChat or Alipay, you really struggle, as I saw, with some foreign tourists struggling to buy water. But Sourish, you certainly are familiar with mobile phones, but also you use your computer quite regularly. And, I would say that you're more reliant on your computer than your mobile phone, which is the opposite of many people in China. So what's your take on this from maybe an outside perspective?
Yes, I only see a mobile phone as essentially something to keep me alive whilst I'm out of my room, essentially. It's the tool that gets me from place A to place B. It's the tool that lets me contact people if necessary, or take notes if I'm out and about. So I very much live a desktop and, to an extent, a laptop first life. And so it's very difficult for me to imagine kind of doing all of my computer activities on a smartphone. However, I do think what you said about the Chinese government pushing it, I do think that's a huge aspect to it, because, China does favor integration, possibly, as you said, so they can stick to their agenda of kind of collecting all the data. It's much easier if just one or two companies do that. Whereas in the West, well, whenever a company tries to do a lot of things, then the government tries to step in and regulate that and attempt that from not happening. And we kind of see the huge lawsuit with Google as an example, where Google doesn't even have their hands in that many baskets, and yet they are trying to, the government is trying to separate Google into multiple divisions. So I don't necessarily see the huge appeal of a smartphone first society. However, as you said, I've also never experienced it. But what I do wonder is, the next level of compute, or the next generation of compute, perhaps is going to be mixed reality or augmented reality glasses or goggles or whatever. And there are currently plenty of countries in the world who are still very underdeveloped compared to the rest of the world. And so as they develop more and more over the next decade or two, and MR, mixed reality, becomes a more widespread thing, are we going to see what just happened in China with smartphones happen to these other countries, but with mixed reality?
I think firstly, just to augment your point about privacy and data collection, I think in China, what you realize very soon is that in order to do a lot of basic activities, such as using one of the shared bikes, or booking a hotel, or booking a train ticket even, you need to be verified with your real government ID, right? And that's not something you need to do in the UK, for example. And that's essentially because of tracking and for the Chinese government to know where you are. And as a result of this, somebody needs to store your data if you are to do this without a human checking your ID, which would be incredibly tiresome if you wanted to use a shared bike and somebody had to check your ID. And so it emerges that WeChat and Alipay and other big tech companies, then they manage your ID and your data, and they can give it to other companies and manage the services, right? And so this really incentivized a centralized structure. It incentivized people to build on WeChat and Alipay, and for these services to be built digital first in one app. And I think the super app model, which people like Elon Musk try to replicate, I think to an extent it can only be done in China because of the government aspect to it. But I think your second point was extremely interesting, because obviously we're only familiar with mobile phones and computers, partially because AR glasses are not in the stage where they're good enough for widespread adoption, right? Both from a technological and a cost perspective. But if you think about what people were thinking 10, 15 years ago, there's no way we could have imagined the mobile phone services that we have today. And similarly, I think there's no way we can imagine what a future with AR is possible. But there's no reason why this won't be the case, right? Given what we saw with smartphones. And I think the only thing we can do is to wish for the betterment of these AR glasses for them to get better, to get smaller, get cheaper, importantly. And if indeed there are countries which hit economic development trajectory similar to that of China, then indeed we may see us paying with eyes instead of your phone or your card, and the new crazy things that hopefully will make our lives better.
I think this change that we've seen between developing countries is also going to happen over generations, because I see in our own generation, most people do rely on smartphones as a significant platform of compute, and many people actually rely on it as their primary platform of compute. And I think as younger and younger people exist, and more of them exist, then I do think we'll slowly see the shift in the West towards the smartphone being our next platform of compute. And perhaps China gives us a glimpse into what the West could look like from a technology perspective in, say, 10, 15, 20 years, once all of us are exclusively on smartphones.
Yes, I do think that's very true, and I think that it's been the case that China has been ahead in many ways in terms of adoption of technology by people than societies in the West. For example, with mobile payments, WeChat Pay was a thing many years ago, way before COVID, and similarly we're seeing recently in the US and in Europe, people are now increasingly engaging with shopping through live streams, shopping through TikTok, etc. And that has been a thing since way before the pandemic in China, right? And so you see many examples of this. I think some services, though, they only exist in China because of the fact that people have your data anyways, right? Apps have it, the Chinese government has it, and so, given this fact, you may as well get whatever you can from it in the form of beneficial services that are convenient. And as a result, because of the fact that we're slightly more conscious of privacy, rightly so, in the West, I'm not sure a lot of these services would fly. And I'm thinking of things like medical data, like booking hospital appointments. Certainly, medical data is very closely guarded in the West. And so I'm not sure some of these services would be able to translate into Western society.
On that note, I actually think that the privacy issues or concerns that we have in the West versus China, I actually think that the landscape is very similar between the two places. Because just because the Chinese government are much more open, or I guess less, they hide their activities a lot less, I think the West still does take a lot of our data and store a lot of our data and go through a lot of our data. And yes, whilst they may have a less deep stronghold into our digital lives, at the click of a button, they can pretty much gain such a deep stronghold in our digital lives because of the amount of data that they are already collecting and viewing on us.
Yes, I agree, and I think that even though the Chinese government has knows what you look like, where you've been, your passport details, etc., etc., in the West, the UK government and Google probably knows that anyways, right? And I think the reason why it's considered a bit more hostile in China is because the Chinese government does not necessarily operate in the rules-based world order that people in Western societies and Western governments idealize, right? And so because of this difference, even though functionally it's pretty similar, it's treated a bit differently. Now, I think that's probably slightly justified, but also, I mean, the difference is then very small, because if both Chinese government and Google know where I am, what I'm doing, right? Then what's the difference? And I think also what is not often brought up is the benefits that what giving up your privacy can bring. And one example that struck me was the safety aspect. Because there's security cameras everywhere, I feel incredibly safe, both me and my belongings, in China in a way that I simply do not in the United Kingdom. And I think my stuff, my things are always going to be stolen. I worry about going outside at night, especially in questionable areas. But I just do not in China because of the fact that security is so much better.
Thank you for listening. We'll be back next Monday with a new episode.
And check out the description to sign up to our weekly newsletter. You can also reach out to us on X at the WaffleByte. See you there.